When it comes to productivity, we know and have known for some time that Canada lags. We lag behind virtually all of the G7 countries. The economists talk about this problem, academics talk about it, business leaders talk about this problem. Today, we're going to speak to an incredibly successful leader who is, these days, a social entrepreneur, which is not a voice maybe we hear enough from these days. Her name is Zita Cobb. She is CEO of Shorefast. She is the innkeeper at the Fogo Island Inn, and she recently published an op-ed on the topic of investment in Canada, which is one of the key drivers of productivity. She co-wrote that with Mary Rowe, the CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute, and she joins us from Joe Bat's Arm on Fogo Island in Newfoundland. Hello there, Zita.
Hello, Bruce. Lovely to be here with you.
Thank you for joining us. We're having this conversation in May. What is the traffic like in Iceberg Alley? If I were lucky enough to be in person and I was well positioned overlooking the sea, what would I observe?
Well, we are in Iceberg Alley, and this year, lots of icebergs out there, lots and lots, probably too many, because you know what that means when there are lots and lots. They're not as close to shore as we would like, but they're there. This year, however, we had no pack ice, which was really quite concerning.
Concerning because
it's melting before it gets here.
Yeah, right.
So like things are changing, and you really see them from here.
Yeah. Your views on investing in Canada, I think, benefit from some context. You are from Fogo Island. You departed, became an extraordinarily successful business leader, including your time as CFO at what became JDS Uniphase. How would you say those years working in traditional business inform your view about the importance of investing in Canada?
Well, I think I maybe need to start before we get to JDS Uniphase, Bruce, if that's okay. Can we start
when I was
10 years old? Because when I was 10 years old, my father, who never had money in his life, never had a bank account, didn't really understand the concept of money, but he understood fish really well. And when he was trying to figure out what had happened with all these monster ships that came and took all the cod, none of his ecological logic answered the questions, and none of his social logic answered the questions, and he didn't really have that kind of economic logic. So he said, when I was 10, he said, they must be turning the fish into money.
Wow.
And he said, when you grow up, you're going to have to leave, and you have to figure out how this money thing works before it eats everything we love.
Wow. Prescient, insightful, and you rose to that challenge for him.
Yes, I did grow up. I did go away. I did study business, and I did work in business, and I'm still trying to figure out how money works, but my dad is long gone, and I feel like what my life is these days is trying to figure out how to turn money into fish.
So I do want to come back to that traditional world in which you operated in so successfully. There was a merger that left you with some assets that you could then deploy to the community that you love so much. But what was it like being from such a small place in Newfoundland and then operating at such a senior level in the Canadian, I'm going to use the jargony word here, the Canadian business ecosystem?
Ecosystem. Yeah.
Ecosystem. People love that word.
You know, I grew up in a community of on an island that is 4 times the size of Manhattan. It has 10 different communities. The one I grew up in is the one I'm sitting in right now, called Joe Bat's Arm. There were 900 people. And if you grow up learning how to get along with 900 people, many of whom you actually don't like, and certainly don't love them all, I think that prepares you really well for getting along in the business world. And you know, it's figuring out how to get things done together, and how, as my dad used to say, we have to muck along together.
Yes, so we have to muck along together.
And so that kind of social logic really, I think, set me up well for being in the world of business. And yeah, I didn't find it that different. I also grew up with 6 brothers, so that also prepared me for the world of business.
I'm sure you learned how to probably, I have only one brother and I had to learn to wrestle and protect myself.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, I also grew up not ever thinking that the world was a zero-sum game. And life is not a zero-sum game. And I think that makes for good business too.
I am one of the people who have been so lucky to have stayed at the Fogo Island Inn and to hear from you directly about what you have been creating there over the course of the last many years. For our listeners, give them a sense for what you were going for here. You built this extraordinary, like, luxury hotel, but one that is deeply, deeply grounded in hospitality and the culture of the island in which it sits.
Yes, maybe, Bruce, a good way to describe the inn is to say, what is it made of? It's made of the place. And so I actually think sometimes in business, we have the wrong words. And as Seamus Haney said, if we can find the words, maybe we can find the way. And one of the words that we don't understand sometimes is the word asset. What is an asset? Because like people call themselves asset managers, and I don't think they're asset managers. I think they're money managers. Money is a resource. And so going back to my career, when I found myself literally on a boat, because I went sailing when I left my career, literally on a boat with more money than I needed to buy groceries. I have this funny relationship with money anyway, in a sense, because I didn't grow up with any, and I don't see it as the asset. I see it as a resource. And so in thinking about this place, and you can apply this to any place, is to think humans are embodied, social, meaning-seeking creatures. Everything we need is in a place. Everything that I know came from a place, mostly from this place. And nature knows everything. There are 2 ways for us humans to kind of understand what nature knows, to learn from nature. One is scientific method, of course, and the other is cultural knowledge, lived experience in a close tangle with a place. And so when I look at Fogo Island, or I look at any community around the world, I see we're losing places. And when we lose places, we lose knowledge. And so
say more about the loss of place, because literally it's not like a chunk of the country dropped into the sea. I'm excluding the ice shelf, but it's more than that. It's not a literal disappearance. It seems like what you're talking about is a breakdown in communities who live on a place.
Exactly. We are losing communities of place. Now, when I use the word community, I should be really clear. I mean a community of place. I don't mean an affinity group or an identity group. I mean some people living in a close enough tangle with each other to have a shared fate, F-A-T-E. So, if the ferry breaks down to Fogo Island, we all realize we're in the same community. We're
pretty quick.
Same place. And so places and communities of place hold knowledge. They hold cultural knowledge. They are places where we can actually be social, and meaning comes from the relational world. All of our relationships are held by place. Our relationships with the past are super important. Our relationships with each other, how we live together, and actually our relationship with the future, because as you steward place, you're actually stewarding it for the people that will come after you in this place. So I think when I was leaving my career and finding myself literally on a boat with more money than I needed, and thinking of my father to say, how do I turn money into something? How do I turn this resource called money into strengthening assets? And I could see that at home, we still have a fishery. We're one of the luckiest fishing communities in that sense. We haven't lost our fishery entirely, although it hurts. What can I do to put another leg on the economy? Because I think about the economy as it should underpin a community. So if we can get stable economies underneath places, then people can build lives with at least as much certainty as life has, which is not that much. I mean,
Mm.
but still, and I think about hospitality, the most hospitable people in the world are the people that feel most secure in their place. When people are, when any of us are insecure, we're not that nice. We're not that hospitable. And so, I mean, Fogo Island is a part of the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, which, I mean, I think we're pretty renowned for hospitality. And I think it's because we have this long-standing, across many centuries, deep, deep attachment to place. And I think that human identity and human meaning making is all about how we're attached to place, because that's how we're tied to each other. So what the questions that I was asking with my brothers when we were starting Shorefast in 2006 was, how do we put a leg on the economy? But more importantly, not more importantly, as importantly, how do we do it in a way that strengthens the assets of the place? And we followed what's called asset-based community development. And the simple questions are, what do we have? I mean, some people might look at Fogo Island and think, my goodness, it's just a rock in the North Atlantic. Yet it has everything. And so what do we have? What do we know? We must surely know something. We might not know a lot about cryptocurrency, but we know about other stuff. We know what happens when the wind blows to the northeast, for example. We know when fish come and when they don't. What do we have? What do we know? What do we love? That's a part of meaning making. What do we miss? And what can we do about it? And as soon as you get to the question of what can we do about it, now we're doing something. We're doing it here. And we're asking other people to work with us to get it done. And so building an inn was the most obvious. If you go through those questions for Fogo Island, you don't have to be all that smart to figure out, we need a fine inn. And there are places around the world, and I've traveled to a lot of them, that have fine inns. And it's when you get that right, every act of commerce supports culture. And every act of culture supports commerce.
Yes, it's beautiful. So as we expand that notion from a small island, you say 4 times the size of Manhattan, to this bigger question, which is where I began the conversation about investing in Canada, what is the essence of that can be reapplied as a part of the solution to a air quotes problem that the economists and the politicians and all these different stakeholders would frame as insufficient investment in Canada? We can't so simply just copy and paste the learnings from Fogo Island times, 10 provinces and 3 territories and all that, but there is learning.
4,500 incorporated communities.
Wow.
Yes, and many, many, many more unincorporated. Of the 4,500, 637 are Indigenous communities, and many, many more hamlets that are not incorporated. And I don't know the exact number, but as an approximation, and I'm hoping people will melt down your email with telling me I'm wrong, that about only 500 of 4,500 have access to commercial banking services.
Wow.
What does that make our country? A bunch of stranded assets.
Right. Huh. Okay. So does it begin with asking that series of questions, somehow getting the members of those communities of place in a room and like, okay, Zita said, ask these questions, someone get a whiteboard.
I think that's exactly it. It's not what we did, it's how we did it. And we're not the only practitioners of asset-based community development, but I think it's helping us see, like, I think what happened in the last 60 years, humans in the biggest, broadest sense, we developed a kind of place blindness. And of course, that I think came about for many reasons, but certainly caused by how the digital revolution has disrupted economic geography. And I mean, who's not seduced by the digital world? Like, the world of bits is so much easier than the world of atoms. In the world of atoms, my hips hurt. In the world of bits, nothing hurts. You can have any kind of a life you want. And so we've all been seduced by that. And we thought, and then we remember when we all thought there was a global village. It's like, yeah, okay, I think we're over that now. And that the world is made up of, and Canada is made up of, and province of a whole bunch of places. And I think for Canada, the huge opportunity in all of this is we just have to figure out one little thing. We have to figure out how to be masters of scale. And what I mean by that is masters of working at all scales.
Hmm.
Money, the resource, has a tendency, if you leave it alone, to get together and be bigger and bigger and bigger pools. And it's happening. We see this. Money tends to move away from the small and the distant and get into bigger bundles in bigger places. And so that's not actually how you build a country. So I want to come back to the productivity question. I have a friend who I grew up with here, and he asked, we were talking about this productivity thing, and he's a retired fisherman, and his name is Pete. And Pete said, so he said, you mean that if we had one great big factory in Toronto that had one employee and a whole bunch of robots, and it produced everything everybody needed, we'd have really high productivity numbers? Is that what you mean? He asked. Well, I said, yeah, I guess we would. And he said, well, what kind of a country would we have? So productivity is important to keep an eye on it, but let's keep an eye on all of the atoms that make up our country. And so back to what have we learned, and other communities like us, like there are communities across this country that are doing on the ground work to develop their economies with the assets they have. And the first trick is understanding what your assets are, and then figuring out how to get the financial resources to invest and develop them. And to do that, you got to think about, let's take tourism as like the best example. And I know a thing or two about tourism. Canada's tourism numbers are not growing the way they should. And we have more tourism assets than any country I can think of.
Yeah.
But they're across this great landmass. So if we all got together and said, okay, let's work together to figure out how to grow our tourism economy, because it's going to strengthen cultures, it's going to give, economic momentum to more places, we would be looking at how do we do better access, air access to the country, around the country. So we invite people to come, we help them get around. Whereas some of the places like the Canadian North, for example, where we have incredible assets, it's incredibly expensive to get there. So we as a country could look at it and go, well, maybe we could help make that a little bit more palatable, because we know the economic activity that's going to come from it is going to be profound. And the social benefit that's going to come from it is going to be profound. So this is a way of working together. During the lockdowns of COVID, we did a pilot project with 4 other communities across the country to ask a simple question. What does it take to strengthen community economies? Because our idea of the economy is that it's the sum of its parts. That's a resilient, strong, distributed economy, geographically diverse. And so with these 5 communities, the answers were 4 things, 4 levers. One was data. We don't actually know how our community economies are doing, because the data is usually a bit too aggregated for us to kind of know. If I want to know the GDI of Fogo Island, I measure it because we can. And access to financial capital. And as I said, money, and we know this, goes into bigger and bigger pools and moves further and further away from small and distant places. But we just have to build the plumbing. Like, we need to build the instruments so that money can flow. We got to make money come down to the ground where we live, make money, let's say. And how do we create the platforms, the collaborative structures to work together across all sectors? Because, communities can't solve this by themselves. There's a fantastic book, which I highly recommend, called The Third Pillar, written by an economist named Rajan. And he makes the most simple assertion. Human societies rest on 3 pillars: markets, governments, and communities. And unless and until we get more functionality in the communities that we have all been busily hollowing out, none of our dreams are going to come true. Like, no matter what policy, no matter how well written it is, if it hits the ground and falls apart, it's not going to work. And so this has to be done together.
We could talk all day, or at least I could talk to you all day. If you would give me all day, I would take it. But we must wrap our time here. And I do want to ask one last question before I go. In your op-ed, you referenced the role of the Canadian pension funds. So they are, we have so many of them. They have access to literally billions of dollars. You've painted a very vivid picture of how this can work at the micro level, at the community level, in the context of place. Then at the top down, at the macro level, are these billions that the pension funds have access to. If you were able to snap your fingers and to have them deploy that capital in a way that would make the biggest difference in this context of solving the investment problem or productivity, however we frame it, what would you have them do?
I would have them join our Community Economies Institute so we can answer the question, and they could help with that, of figuring out how do we activate, let's say, pick any sector, but I say tourism for now, a tourism economy in this country. We need to build some assets. There are lots of amazing properties that we could invest in that would make them stronger. And let's think about how we invest in transportation. That is going to invite people to not only invite them to come, actually make it possible for them to come, because then we're going to see economic momentum in the country. And, maybe it wouldn't be as big a return as if you make a hit in crypto. I'm not saying they're investing in crypto, by the way. Yeah. But, I think you'd be pretty good darn returns. And Canadians would also see not just the financial return in their pension funds, they see the social returns in their communities.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Thank you so much for your time in this conversation, but also in your leadership of bringing these ideas to life in such a warm, compassionate, and practical way. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Zita Cobb, CEO of Shorefast, innkeeper of the Fogo Island Inn. She wrote a recent op-ed piece on this question of how we can invest in our country, I think, for the good of all Canadians, both now and in the generations to come.